warm welcome to all of you, and thanks so much for joining us and spending some of your time to watch this webinar in which we're going to talk about how a deterioration model setup or a DMS file is linked to your ForwardWorks program. And we'll also cover the topic of why a DMS needs to be linked to your ForwardWorks program, because that's a question that many of our JunoViewer users often have. So this topic is not as simple as it seems, because there are several components related to the joining of a DMS file to your ForwardWorks program. And we're going to cover that in depth now in this webinar. So I estimate it will take approximately 25 minutes, and then we'll add to that some question time. So what we're going to cover in this webinar is we'll take, first of all, a look at the architecture and components involved in the linking of a DMS with your ForwardWorks program. Next, we will look at the question that we often get, where a user will say, but I'm not interested in modeling. I'm not a modeler. Why do I need to link a DMS to my ForwardWorks program? So we'll look into that in some detail. Then we'll show some screenshots of key elements involved in this process and the workflow. Now, in the previous webinars, we found that it's very distracting if you show a PowerPoint presentation with some animations, which I've got in this presentation, and then you need to close down your presentation, go to JunoViewer, come back in again, and so forth. So what I've done in this presentation is just put screenshots, and I hope that I'll be able to nicely walk you through the process. And you can still join if you have a JunoViewer registration or you're in the training account. Then I want to encourage you, while we're doing this introduction, maybe see if you can fire up JunoViewer and get your screen sorted so that you can watch this presentation, and at the same time go into the necessary screens as I'm explaining how to get there. So after we've gone through the screenshots and the details of what's involved, I'll explain next steps in this learning journey and show you the resources that you can access to learn more about this topic. And then we'll have our question and answers. I think this webinar will be useful if you are interested at this stage in modeling, but do not really know where to start. Or maybe you're already linking a DMS to your ForwardWorks program and just pressing buttons, but you don't quite know how everything fits together behind the scenes. I think then this webinar will also be of use to you. So when we're talking about linking a DMS to a JunoViewer ForwardWorks program, where are we in JunoViewer in terms of the menu system? So as you can see in this screenshot, we basically are working under the modeling menu. And in that modeling menu, for today's topic, we are mainly interested in these two menu items: forecast models and managing model data. Okay, so if you've got JunoViewer open, just remember that is where most of the action for today's webinar is going to take place. Now, what components are involved in the linkage of a ForwardWorks program with a DMS? First of all, you need a preloaded set of segments, and these segments will be with or without treatments that have been assigned. So this is basically your ForwardWorks program, which will have a specific version if you've already imported it. And if it's without treatments, of course, it's not strictly speaking a ForwardWorks program. We generally refer to it as an empty ForwardWorks program. I'll just use the term ForwardWorks program in this webinar. The next component then is the vital DMS or Deterioration Model Setup file. This is an Excel template that contains the setup and all the formulae that you need for triggering treatments, for predicting how your network is going to deteriorate over time, and the analysis of costs and quantities of treatments. The third component is the setup and constraints that your model may need. Now, some of these setups and constraints are optional depending on what type of model you are using. generally, it will involve budgets for a cost constraint model, quantities that are allowed for a quantity constraint model, unit costs and unit rates for treatments, a set of committed treatments, and then if you are running a KPI-based or a goal-seeking model, you will need a predefined set of KPI targets that your model has to meet at every year during the modeling run. When you're linking a ForwardWorks program with a DMS and with model constraint data, that linkage, that setup of combining these three components together is what we call in JunoViewer a model setup. So don't confuse a model setup with a deterioration model setup or a DMS. Those terms are closely aligned, but they're not the same thing. A model setup is stored and then can be reused over and over. And you can also edit your model setup at a later stage. So how are these components linked to each other? So this is JunoViewer, the web application. And this is the starting point, which is your versioned ForwardWorks program, basically a set of modeling segments representing your network. Now, this ForwardWorks program can come from an external source when you import it in JunoViewer. If you have done, for example, modeling in some other software and you've already got treatments, then you're just going to import it and it will sit there in your JunoViewer database. Alternatively, you can use one of the the features to generate segment sets, either just based on fixed length or by using uniform subsectioning tools. You can generate an empty ForwardWorks program into JunoViewer. The next component then is the vital DMS file, which is the Excel template that I've explained earlier. And the third component is the constraints and the setups that feed into your model. So these three components together comprise the model setup. And in the model setup and constraint data, just to go over that again, you have these optional things to link into your model, such as your budget constraints, your quantity constraints, if you're running a quantity constraint model, unit costs for treatments, a set of committed treatments, and KPI targets. Now, once again, many of these components here at the bottom are optional. You don't need to have them for every model you're going to run, but for some modeling scenarios, for example, if you're running a KPI-driven model, then they are not optional. But for example, committed treatments, if you've already have your treatments in your ForwardWorks program, you don't need to apply committed treatments. But there are some scenarios where having your data outside of the DMS and outside of your ForwardWorks program at the start of the modeling run is beneficial. And those details are a bit too detailed for this webinar, but just be aware that you do have options when you're deciding whether or not to make use of these external, well, it's external to the DMS and the ForwardWorks program, but it's internal to JunoViewer when you are using this model setup and constraint data. Now we get to the question, I'm not interested in modeling, why do I need to link a DMS or a model to my ForwardWorks program? Well, even if you do not intend to trigger or select treatments, even if you've done all of your modeling outside of JunoViewer, in order to use your ForwardWorks program in the virtual field inspection tool or the field inspection tool or in the forecast view, JunoViewer needs to know something, some metadata about your type of treatments that you have in your ForwardWorks program. For example, JunoViewer needs to know the treatment types, the names of your treatments and the categories of your treatments. And this is needed for getting breakdown summaries of treatment costs, to populate drop-down lists in the field inspection tool, and so forth. We also need to know for each of your treatments, what are the default units and rates for cost calculations. You need to have at least one predicted parameter, for example, surface age, in order to use the forecast view. And then JunoViewer needs to know for use in the forecast view what your modeling period is. and so forth. So here I've got, for example, the forecast view. And as I've said to you, that the treatment type names. So if you are in the forecast view and you want to change one of these treatments, if you click on this and go to the treatment tab to change that treatment, JunoViewer needs to know what options to present to you, right? We can't just allow a user to type in anything in those boxes. If there's a spelling mistake or a space where there shouldn't be a space, it can create havoc further downstream. And those will be headaches that will come back and bite you as the user. So at some stage, you will have to provide JunoViewer with some information, some metadata about your ForwardWorks program and the treatments in your ForwardWorks program. So the DMS is a very logical place to do that, because the DMS already provides a structured template for you to provide treatment details for your model. So that is the key reason why we are enforcing the linkage of a DMS with your ForwardWorks program before you can take that ForwardWorks program out into the field or view it in your forecast view. As I said, also in your DMS, you've got your units for cost calculations, and it tells JunoViewer which columns in your ForwardWorks program contains the quantities that will be used to calculate costs. And that again drives this type of table at the bottom of the forecast view with all of the different costs that are involved in your model. So we can't really do without some sort of meta information about your ForwardWorks program, and the DMS is the place where it takes place. So even if you've got a absolutely minimal model in your DMS, it's still useful because it contains information about the treatment types, the colors, for example, to be displayed here, and so forth. And all of that is the appropriate place to show that is in your DMS. So the DMS is really a way to understand, for JunoViewer to understand what treatments are involved. And as I've said, this is needed for cost summaries, forecast view display, and for selecting treatment names in the field inspection tools. Okay, so now let's take a look at JunoViewer. Once again, if you're logged into JunoViewer, I'm going to go through this in a way that will make it easy for you to follow along. So the first step is to go to the modeling main menu and select the submenu item called forecast models. And this will open up this page. And this screenshot is from the training account in JunoViewer. So in this example, you can see the ForwardWorks programs that have already been linked. And the first element to note here is that at the bottom of this page, or not right at the bottom, but towards the bottom, there is a place for you to conveniently upload your DMS file. Now, the DMS needs to have some security associated with it, because often clients have their intellectual property implemented in their models, and they want to protect that to make sure that even within their organization, not everyone has access to it. So not all users can actually manage and download and upload DMS files, but that's a more complex topic, the security around the DMS, which we can perhaps handle in a separate webinar. Just know that this is also the page on which you upload and download your DMS files. This button here is then the one where you click to add a new setup. And then also, if you select an existing setup like this row that has been highlighted here, you can click on Edit Setup to edit that setup. And the windows that open for adding a new setup and editing existing setup are almost identical. Okay, so if you click on the Add New Setup button, this window will open here, or this pop-up will open over your page. And in this pop-up, you basically see all of the components that I've already introduced you to. So first of all, you are going to see a drop-down here after you've selected the network on which you want to work, you will see a drop-down which is going to present you with all the versions of the ForwardWorks programs that have been pre-uploaded for this network. Next, you can give a user-friendly label for your ForwardWorks program. This is normally by default the same as your ForwardWorks program version code, but you could enter something else in there, for example, ForwardWorks program with high budget scenario or some sort of name like that. And when you export your model data, that label will be exported with the metadata for your model so that it is an explanatory way for you to understand exactly what this ForwardWorks program entails. Then this is the drop-down where you will see the DMSs that have been uploaded already, and you can then pick the DMS or the master DMS that you want to associate with this ForwardWorks program. And then down here, you have all of the model constraints and setup data that I've already discussed earlier. Now, depending on which one of these drop-downs you're looking at, you may see this entry that says use from DMS file. So for example, if your budget is contained already in your DMS, then you will pick in this option use from DMS file. But if you've pre-uploaded several budget scenarios already, then you will see here the budget scenarios that are available, and you can pick one of them to associate with this model run. The treatment costs, they are by default generally held in the DMS, but if you've got other versions to apply to different scenarios, you can also pre-select them here. Treatment quantity targets, generally, I find most of our users will only run cost-constrained models, not quantity constrained. So this will generally be set to not applicable. And then very important, your committed treatments version. Now, very often your treatments, if you are doing any sort of modeling run where you are triggering treatments, then you may have some predefined treatments in your ForwardWorks program. But if you do a model development, you often want to run your model over and over. And when you do that, every time you redo your model run, you need to clear those treatments. In that case, it's essential that you place your committed treatments outside of the ForwardWorks program and then link them to your model run here so that those committed treatments will be reapplied to your ForwardWorks program at the start of the model, even if you have deleted all of the existing treatments in the ForwardWorks program. And then finally, there's the KPI Targets version, which is applicable if you are running a KPI constrained or a goal-seeking model for KPI targets. The last two elements are not really model data, but just settings that you can set. Once again, you can, by default, use the model initialization year and the termination year that is in the DMS. Or if you untick these boxes, you can enter in there. For example, my model initialization year is 2021, and I want to run the model until 2040. So you just enter that in there, and then you click on Add Setup, and the setup will be added. And then from that point on, generally, I just want to go back one page. Generally, you will be taken back to this window, and what you can then do is just select the setup that you've just added. You can see that you will be able to identify it easily by looking at the ForwardWorks program version and the DMS file that have been selected, because that combination has to be unique. And then you can, after you've selected that, you can check that model. So we're not going to go into modeling in this webinar, but that's the start of the modeling process, is to check whether this DMS is correctly formulated. And once you've checked, that check is completed, you will either see some warnings or errors that you first have to correct, or you will see a button here which says run forecast, or if you've got a trigger model, it will say run trigger model. So that is where the modeling process starts and the creation of your model setup ends. So let's just go a bit forward and go and look at the adding and editing of model constraints and setup data. So to get to this page in JunoViewer, you go to the modeling main menu and then select the submenu item, manage model data. And this should bring you to a page that looks like this. Now, I'm in the training account. If you are in your live account and you have not used some of these features, you may see nothing, or it may look very different from what you're seeing here. But the layout of this page should be exactly the same. And the first thing to note is you've got tabs here at the top, which will be, these tabs represent the components that I've introduced earlier, such as your budget, treatment costs, committed treatments, treatment target quantities, and KPI data. So make very sure that when you are in this page, that you select the appropriate tab, because very often when you get in here, for example, if you're working on committed treatments and you go out of this page to upload a file or look at something else, and you have committed treatments in your mind's focus, and you end up on this page again, and you don't see that you're in the budget sheet or on the budget tab, if you go down here and import go and look at the files here, you may import that committed treatment set into the budgets table, and it's going to warn you and tell you you can't do that. So that's often a place where I've gotten stuck. The answer is just very easily to just go to the right tab and do it again. JunoViewer won't allow you to import committed treatments into the budget table. So it will check that your data is correctly formulated before you actually import it. So once you've selected the correct tab, at the top here, you can select the network that you're working in, and then you can see version codes for budgets or committed treatment sets that have been uploaded. So this is to view and edit existing data. It's not really for uploading new data. Now note that whatever you're uploading, budgets or committed treatments, you always have to give it a version code. And the reason for that is because, remember earlier, when you define your model setup, you've got a drop-down list where you're going to pick the budget version code. And that is exactly this version code that you're seeing here. Then in this table, you basically have a way to just have a quick view at the data that's in this whatever it is, whether committed treatments or budgets that you're working with. This is a place for you to download this selected set, whatever it is. You can download it as an Excel file to go and edit it or correct errors in it. Or you could download an empty template, which will show you the format of your data that JunoViewer is expecting. And then finally, there's a place for you here to upload, to select, sorry, this is not upload or re-upload, it's just to select a pre-uploaded file and sheet, and then give a version before you import that budget or committed treatment set into your database. Now, one thing I want to just point out here is very often I find that a user may prepend the word budget before the version code because he's on the budget sheet or she's on the budget sheet or committed sheet. But that's not necessary because the available budgets will only be presented to you in the correct context. So rather use the space that you've got available to just enter a descriptive name. You don't have to tell JunoViewer this is a budget because it knows you're working with a budget. So for example, I would say maybe something like high budget 10 million per year or something like that. And normally I would use underscores between words rather than spaces between words, because downstream that may cause some problems. So that's just a tip for you to consider. So this is basically the gist of everything that's involved in creating a model setup. And I hope this has been useful for you to understand what exactly are these components that link together when you create a model setup. Now, the one final thing that I want to just clarify, for those of you that are completely new to the concept of the DMS, how does the DMS talk to your ForwardWorks program? So I'm going to just try and explain it again for those that are very new to it, because very often people hear that your model is driven by a DMS and the DMS is an Excel template. So they get the idea that JunoViewer takes all of your data and puts it into JunoViewer or into Excel, and then you just somehow extract all of it again. Now, of course, we don't do that because you may have 50,000 rows in your ForwardWorks program, and we don't want to put that at the same time in Excel. You just can't do that in Excel. So how it works is your DMS is just a calculation engine. It's not a data repository for your model. So basically, you are going to start off with this, your ForwardWorks program. So this is just a schematic representation of your ForwardWorks program in a JunoViewer database. The next component then is your DMS, an Excel template, which is held securely in the JunoViewer file system. And the key element then is the inputs that your DMS is expecting. And the template in the DMS explains to you exactly how that works. In the DMS, we call this placeholders. Now, what the model will do, it will start by looping over all the rows in your ForwardWorks program, and one by one, it will extract the information, put it in the DMS for that single segment. And once that operation is completed, of course, your Excel template is going to do all of the calculations that you have set up in your DMS. And this is where you can be as creative as you want to be in terms of which equations, lookup tables, model parameters, and so forth are involved. The DMS is structured in a way to take care of all of that. And then the outputs that are needed to step forward to the next year is placed in an output area in placeholders. And JunoViewer will then know where this is located because of the way that the template is set up. And it will take that information back into the database and insert it into the database. And then JunoViewer goes to the next row in your ForwardWorks program, and it repeats that. And every time it goes through this, if it is triggering a treatment or assigning a treatment, JunoViewer's model framework will automatically update your budgets and the quantities that have been applied and so forth, so that the constraints can be applied to your model. And the same goes for KPI models. Every time that you update the treatment, the KPIs will be monitored to see whether the model is achieving the target KPIs or not. And once the model is looped through all of these segments, then of course you have a full set of model outputs. Now, the model outputs is actually multi-dimensional in the JunoViewer database. I'm just, for simplicity, I'm just representing both the ForwardWorks program and the model output here as a flat file, but it's actually a bit more complex behind the scenes. So I hope that clarifies for you exactly how the DMS works in principle. So I'm hoping that some of you will be a bit encouraged by this webinar to explore the modeling further, especially if you're new to modeling. And if that's the case, then I think the best place for you to start is with the Lonrix YouTube channel. So if you just go to the Google search bar and you type Lonrix space YouTube, you should end up on the Lonrix channel. It looks like this. And the starting place for anything related to modeling is to go to the playlists tab over here. And I would recommend that you'll see there's quite a lot of videos that we've already uploaded. A lot of them are about webinars. But the place to start for modeling would be with this tutorial, which goes through a step-by-step process in showing you how to build a model from scratch up to a simple trigger model. And I think that should be enough to get you going and for you to understand exactly how your model can be, your modeling process can be initiated, and from there you can build further. So I think apart from the questions, which we'll take shortly, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. We know that all of you are quite busy professionals, so we really appreciate you spending time to learn more about JunoViewer. And I just want to encourage you to give us feedback if there's anything specific that you'd like to see in other topics on the webinar, or if you think there's something we can improve in the way we present the webinars, please email us at that email address. And yeah, thanks for watching.